Have you ever felt like your child is struggling, but not enough to qualify for help? They're bright, they're trying, but school still feels like a battle. What if the problem isn't your child, but the system? For decades, schools have measured every child against the ideal learner or the norm. But what happens when your child's amazing brain learns differently? When your child struggles in school, the first instinct is, get tutoring. But what if the issue isn't the lesson? It's the learning process itself. So today we're unpacking what educational therapy is and how that can change the story. So if you've ever thought, I know my child can do it, but something is missing, then this conversation is for you. Does your child have a speech-language delay and you really want them to talk? Do difficult behaviors derail home life and you know the frustration is a communication struggle? Does your child see a speech therapist and you wonder, what do they do and how can I help? If these or similar questions are in your mind, this podcast is for you. Hello, my name is Dinalynn Rosenbusch. I am a speech-language pathologist that has worked with children from birth to 21 for 3 decades. And in my classrooms, I see you wanting to connect with the heart of your child, but their speech and language skills create a barrier. So if you have a kiddo that has difficult behaviors, needs to expand their language or learn to say speech sounds, and maybe even receives speech therapy, stay tuned, because in this podcast, you will learn how to use your daily life as a tool to communication practice and how to do that practice. You will become confident knowing you are making the difference you want to make. And you will hear success stories of parents who have navigated these struggles already. We'll do this all while focusing on building deep, meaningful connection and confidence in your kiddo. So grab a cup of coffee along with a notebook and pen. It's time to speak in the way your child's brain understands. And that is the language of play. I've been using a tool called Podgagement. It's a fun way to see where in the world the language of play is ranking. Today, as I record this announcement, I want to recognize the countries that the language of play was a top parenting podcast in, and give you a special thank you to the listeners in these countries. They were Iceland, Kyrgyzstan, Oman, Sri Lanka, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Brazil, Taiwan, Greece, Vietnam, Turkey, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and India. So I am so honored and so grateful for each one of you who listens, even if at this moment we did not rank in your country. Maybe we did yesterday. Maybe we might in an hour. Podcast statistics can be fickle, and it's always still a joy to celebrate this moment's top rankings with you. Now I have a new review to share as well. This person, Melanie from Canada, leaves 5 stars as she writes, as expert help for parents. Dinalynn's wisdom about how children communicate is gold. Communication equals connection. Is your child struggling to communicate in a positive way? Highly recommend you seek out Dinalynn's help. Thank you, Melanie. I appreciate it. And if anyone else has not yet left their review, I would love it if you would head on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a written review, because it really warms my heart when I read those reviews. Now moving on to our sponsor. This is Lightning Admin VA. You don't have to do it all. Being a mom and a business owner means you're wearing all the hats, and it's exhausting. Cindy at Lightning Admin VA can help take some of that weight off your shoulders. She handles the admin work so you can show up for your family without letting your business or life fall behind. Email Cindy at lightningadminva.com. And you can look in the show notes, of course, and you will have the link there. When kids don't qualify for help, it's heartbreaking. I typically have seen either of these two reactions played out. The first one is parents are let down because their hope was in the school to be able to help their kids. And they know their kids need help, and they're being told no because their child did not score low enough. And as many of you realize, that's one of the big reasons that I started the Language of Play podcast and coaching programs. The second response is an unfortunate belief that I hear parents say. They are relieved that their child did not qualify, and they say, oh, good, they're doing fine. Since they did not qualify, they're doing exactly what a kid should do at their age. Well, and that's not necessarily the case. There is a reason they were referred to special education assessments in the first place. In the schools in the United States, speech therapy falls under the category of special education, so we must follow those same rules. What is considered normal or typical is very wide. The truth is that the difference between someone who scores a 70 and someone who scores a 72 is functionally nothing. But for help, it's everything. And if you want to understand these details better, I go in depth on explaining qualifications in the last episode, number 237. When you're in this position, your child does need help. And frankly, so do parents. You know it too. You see the missed communication at home. You hear the sentences your child creates to communicate, but you do a lot of reading between the lines to help them along. There are resources available to fill this gap, like the Language of Play coaching programs for parents. But what about academics? Well, there are resources for this too. You can also work with an educational therapist. Never heard of that? Well, I hadn't either, and that is why this episode is happening. Listen in to learn what an educational therapist is and when to use their services and how to access them with today's guest. And of course, if you want to get speech and language help for your kiddo, you can contact me at hello@thelanguageofplay.com. Now let's begin this fascinating pre-recorded episode. Educational therapy. What is that? Well, today we are going to find out with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. Dr. Bibi Pirayesh holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and education from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree in developmental psychology from Columbia University, where her work focused primarily on children's development of mathematical thinking and cognitive neuroscience. She has worked as a learning specialist and educational therapist in private practice for over a decade. And today, Dr. Bibi is here with us to talk with us about educational therapy and why this is a social justice issue. Welcome, Dr. Bibi. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dinalynn. I'm very excited.
Yeah, I'm excited. Let's start with right off the bat. Tell us what educational therapy actually is.
Sure, yeah. It's kind of a little bit of a funny thing because I think depending on your geographical location, people may have never heard of educational therapy, and I think it's an incredibly important and helpful resource and field for parents of kids whose children have learning disabilities, learning differences, etc. Educational therapy is a field that actually has a long history, grew out of Europe. It came to the US in the 1900s, and it's essentially a field where educators are specifically trained in how learning actually develops and happens in the brain, and as a result study how that learning process can break down and how to specifically teach kids who have different types of breakdowns in their learning. So I think the closest thing to it sort of in the public school world is maybe a special education teacher, but I think an educational therapist is uniquely different from a special education teacher and is a professional who is available to work with families outside of school much like a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist would be.
That is a good description. When I hear educational therapy, the first time I heard of it, I thought, oh, what is that? Did kids get harmed by their educational experience and they need therapy? So my idea was entirely wrong. But you're saying that this is more for families to be able to get extra support. And you're not working in the schools, or you are working in the schools?
So let me sort of begin with what you said. I don't think that your idea was completely wrong because a lot of kids are quite harmed by the school systems that they're forced to kind of navigate. And educational therapy, the word therapy is really central there because there is also a great deal of training for professionals in how to deal with the emotional um, components of what it means to have a learning disability, what it means to have to oftentimes fight the school system because we are unfortunately still in a world where learning disability is very much stigmatized,
Mm.
and people generally have ableist beliefs about students. So there is harm and trauma, and that is a part of the work that we do. But
Okay, so let's
essentially,
let's
go
stop
ahead, go
there and
ahead.
unpack a little bit of that before we move
Sure.
on to the next part of what you're going to say. So describe how it is that you see kids harmed by the school system. Because I know that many kids are fortified by the school system, and yet
Hmm.
in this experience of disability, I know that parents have cried with me about what is an IEP and how do we
Hmm.
deal with it. And and also it is supposed to be the governing document that supports families. And yet
Hmm.
there's so much angst around it. So I'm thinking the harm is in this arena.
Hmm.
And yeah, and can you
Well,
expand on that?
yes, the harm is in that arena and kind of beyond. So, first of all, the entire way that our school system is set up is based on the idea that there is what you might call an ideal student, an ideal learner. And then everyone else is kind of measured against that. But unfortunately, the ideal student that we kind of presume is one type of student. It's not all types of students. So, for example, for me, I happen to be a very linear learner. I was very good at school. But if I had been placed in a different kind of schooling environment where being, a different type of learner was the ideal learner, then I might have been the disabled student. In other words, disability doesn't necessarily exist in the mind of the child, but rather is socially constructed. So
Sure.
that's sort of the beginning of where kind of our harm and issues can arise. But
And
even after, sure, go ahead, go ahead.
ableist beliefs
Hmm.
is something else you said. And I kind of think
Hmm.
that's woven into what you just said, right?
Hmm.
Can you
Yes.
define for our listeners ableist beliefs?
Yeah, ableism, like many of the other types of isms, sexism, racism, etc., all again falls under this idea. I mean, all of it begins with this idea that there is a pre-described ideal against which everyone else is measured. So in the case of ableism, we're talking about both physical and cognitive abilities. So in the same way that in terms of racism or sexism, we might think about it in terms of gender or in terms of race and ethnicity, with ableism, it has to do with our whether it's physical or cognitive abilities. So again, the idea is that there is in terms of ableism for learning disability, there is an ideal learner. It's a very narrow definition, but it's the one that rules everything that we do. So when we talk about, a great student or an A+ student, it's a very, very narrow definition. And then the way that things, because all of our policies, all of our laws, all of our systems are set up based on that, what ends up happening is anyone who doesn't quite fit that becomes marginalized, and is as a result I mean, quite literally discriminated against.
Yeah, I can see that idea. You know, we know this, we live
Mm-hmm.
this, but until
Mm-hmm.
you're faced with it and really think about it, I don't know that we have thought about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that is that part of the real foundation of your job your job title.
Yeah, I mean, for me, just to give you kind of this will give you a little bit of background. I mean, I came into this field, um, I think with a very naive view of I want to help these children who are not quite fitting into the system. And my idea was that I was going to support them. I was going to help them. I believe that they can do it. And in many cases, they would. But over time, what I really began to realize is that by doing that, by sort of like assuming that the status quo is correct and assuming that the support has to come from, for the students so that they can fit into the system, I'm actually helping to uphold a rather unfair status quo. Every time I go into an IEP meeting, we all just kind of begin with the assumption that the way that the school system is doing things is the way to do it, and this child doesn't fit. And how are we going to either accommodate, allow, help this child to fit into this system, or how are we going to decide that they can't and maybe they need to go a different route, as opposed to asking a deeper question, which is, but are you doing what you need to be doing in order to support this child? So in other words, it's the difference between setting up a system that says, we're like this, you need to fit here, as
Mhm.
opposed to saying, who are the children in front of me, and how am I going to create a system that's going to reflect whatever it is that they're already bringing to me.
Ah, that sounds
So
beautiful.
yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, I feel like anyone who is in education would agree with that.
Hmm.
For those of us who are in private practice, it's a lot easier because we are working with kids one-on-one. So creating a curriculum that reflects whatever it is that they're bringing is easier. I mean, my point here is not to say that classroom teachers have an easy job. It's very difficult to differentiate from multiple students. But the point is that ideologically, we don't see it that way. In the school system, ideologically, we think, no, you need to fit us. And we are going to determine all the ways in which you do or you don't. So when you think about diagnosis, when you think about special education eligibility, all of those things have been created usually by what we would call neurotypical people.
Hmm.
So the voices of people who are not neurotypical have just been completely left out. They are just left to suffer the consequences of the decisions and the policies that we have created. So that's another way in which it's ableist.
Sure. And since we think of it as a small amount of people that actually fit the ideal, which is in any case a small amount fit the ideal, if we go with that, nearly everybody is neurodiverse, then not neurotypical if we say it in that way.
Yeah, and I think that that's another, one of the issues that I take actually with the term neurodiversity, is that it's almost meaningless because to be human is to be neurodiverse.
I've been in that
Um,
conversation already.
right,
Yes.
right. So it only becomes a thing when we make a decision that there is some norm, some ideal, some way of being. But if we let
Yeah.
go of that, then we begin to see that no, it's just everyone's different and everyone's, bringing in something different. And that's actually by design because we need all kinds of thinkers and learners in order for the world to work.
Mhm.
It doesn't make sense for us to kind of force everyone into this one way of thinking and being.
Right. All right. So now for the families that think to
Mhm.
themselves, I've never heard of educational therapy, and I don't know how that's going to benefit me or how that's different from my child getting special education in the school.
Mhm.
Can you speak to that parent that is listening to you wondering, how does this pertain to me?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I think it's really important to talk about students that I would say what I sort of refer to as a gray zone. They fall into a gray zone. In other words, their challenges are not, for lack of a better word, severe enough
Mm-hmm.
to qualify them for any kind of eligibility or service through the school system.
Sure.
However, they are still struggling.
Yes.
So, without getting into a whole discussion on the, diagnoses and student and special ed eligibility, there is a huge portion of the population that do not fall into that category but still need support. So that's one big group, I think that, you know, can get support from educational therapists. Now, how they go about getting support from ed therapists versus tutors is another question that I often get. Because parents, when their child is not doing well in school, oftentimes the first thing that they try to do to support them is to get them tutoring. But what they often find when the need is beyond that is that the tutoring doesn't actually work. And the reason that it doesn't work is that a tutor's job is to teach content, but the educational therapist's job is to teach learning, how to learn, and is also to remediate different types of things that might be getting in the way of that learning. So it's sort of the metaphor that I give parents is, imagine that your child is trying to ride on a bicycle, and the one of the tires is flat. It's not working. So a tutor usually just comes and tries to hold the bicycle and help them along without addressing the flat tire. The job of the educational therapist is to replace the tires, to fix the tire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I say that carefully because I don't necessarily believe in a view that we have to fix everything. But there are certain things that we can remediate. And that's another way in which I think educational therapists can oftentimes defer from what happens in the special education world. Because in the special education world, really the requirement is access. And so a lot of times what we see is accommodations and modifications. We don't always see remediation. So then you sort of get into a place where kids are sort of being passed along without the learning issue being addressed. And that's another way in which a good educational therapist can help families. Unfortunately, I wish that was something that was happening within the context of the school system, but the school system is not legally required to make sure that your child can learn. They're only required to make sure that they can access the curriculum. So it's a different standard.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And yeah, that is the verbiage that we have. Hmm.
Mhm.
So now, how would a parent know if they are to seek out a tutor versus an educational therapist? If I have a child that is struggling and they did their testing, they don't qualify to get help, and part of me is thinking, all right, they're doing fine, but yet I see that they're really actually struggling.
Mhm.
The only thing I've heard of is a tutor, and I'm wondering
Right.
now that I hear this, who do I go to and how do I do it?
And how do I do it? Right. Since your audience is primarily parents, what I can actually do, because this is a question that we get a lot in the field, how
I bet you
what
do.
is the yes, yes. Well, how do we distinguish?
Yeah.
So what I can do is I can put together a little PDF, a little chart that sort of helps parents be like, okay, well, if this is my child's issue, do I go here or do I go here? Do I go here or do I go here? Do I go with a tutor or do I go with an ed therapist? Because
That's
it
very
is
generous of
it
you.
is
Thank you.
complex. It's my pleasure. Yes. I think it's an important sort of solid thing to have in your hand. And what I can also include on there is information about, okay, so like let's say that you then decide you do want to explore educational therapy. What is the best way to go about that? We have a national organization, a website, where they can go and put in their zip code and get lists of people. So I can certainly include that in there too.
Oh, that sounds like it would be a very, very good resource for our parents. So thank you, Dr. Beebe. I
Of course.
appreciate that. I really like to provide for the parents resources that they can grab a hold of and get the answers to what it is
Hmm.
that they're actually looking for. So,
Right, right.
so thank you. This has been a learning for me as well because, as you know, I was not familiar with educational therapy until you had contacted me and I said, "Tell me about that." And
Yes.
yeah, and so this is really fun to bring something that's also new to me to the audience.
Well, and I think it's really, part of my goal also for our field in educational therapy, because we're licensed differently from people who are OTs or SLPs. There does seem to be some disconnect, and one of the things that happens, as you may know, is that there does tend to be a lot more concrete kind of understanding of the types of supports that children need when they're younger. So,
Mhm.
when it comes to their motor skills, when it comes to their sensory skills, when it comes to their language skills, all of these things, and parents can often, hopefully, get those resources in place. But then once kids are off into school, they don't really have something to transition to. And the fact is that the majority of students that, for example, I see as an ed therapist do have a history of OT or language related issues.
I bet they would.
Um, yes, exactly. And so I think that that collaboration and understanding between different professionals is also really, really important, because to be able to say, okay, well, we've worked on this language stuff, but chances are this is going to impact reading and reading comprehension and writing. So, maybe look into it therapy for supports that might be available. I think that could be really helpful.
I think that sounds fantastic. And I have to say, I love how you use all that neuroscience because that's where I've just nerded out myself, loving learning how people learn and what it is that goes on, especially in that developing brain,
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
figure out why are they not listening? What's going on in the meantime? Why did they not do what you expected that they would do given the situation? And why is reading impacted? And, like so many different things. I would be very curious if you and I talk more about what we have in common, because it
Hmm.
feels like there's a lot in common.
There is a lot in common, and I think that's another huge distinction. So people in fields like ours, people with our sorts of backgrounds, have training where we're trained to look at learning and development. We're
Mhm.
trained to look at brain development. And that's very different than what happens in the school system, because there, for teachers, the training is on curriculum. And so there's often this kind of divide between, okay, well, what happens when this curriculum doesn't work for this child? But there's no training there then, and it sort of just falls apart. And one of the reasons that I love educational therapy and why it was just such a natural transition for me from my background in neuroscience was because there is a processing skills approach. So looking at the neurodevelopmental constructs, where are things breaking down? We know that we can create new neurons through training and remediate those things.
Yes.
And all of that, unfortunately, tends to be missing from our education system. So yeah, it can be really tough on parents.
Yeah, that sure can be. And I know that in some schools, like some of the schools I've worked in, there's a heavy emphasis for particularly the special education department to get that kind of brain-based training.
Hmm.
And then in the regular education, we tend to have more curriculum-based training, but then like I would go into classrooms and help teachers in different ways, and other special ed teachers would too, with some of the brain-based background. And so
Hmm.
I can see that there is this disconnect that you're talking about, but it's not for lack of effort. I see the teachers working
No.
so hard with such sincere hearts, but yet at the same time, this is definitely something that is needed as teacher education as well
Hmm.
as parent education. And I will also say that I love that you have made yourself available to parents, especially the ones that fall in that gap. The gap of
Hmm.
I'm struggling, but I don't qualify because I'm not that bad. which is a hard
Right.
place to be.
It's a very hard place to be. Yeah. Unfortunately, I sometimes find myself telling parents, don't get extra supports for your child in order for their grade to go up, because it's not until they fail that they're going to be able to get the resources they need, which is, I mean, it's tragic to have to do that. But yeah, unfortunately, that is the way that the system's set up.
It is a failure system. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Bibi, thank you for your insights. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for the work that you do for families. Very much appreciate that you're on the show today and to have this time with you. Thank you for sharing your time.
Thank you so much for offering your platform. Thank you, and for all the great
My
work you
pleasure.
do.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure. Hey, listeners, don't forget that the links to the people and the resources mentioned in this episode are found in the show notes. Hey parents, I hope you found this episode helpful. If so, would you please take 30 seconds and share it with a friend who also lives or works with children? I would really appreciate it if you would leave a quick review for the show on Apple Podcasts. I read every review and it lights me up to know that this show is making a difference. Then come join my Facebook community, where you'll meet other parents who are dedicated to helping their children grow too. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thank you for joining me. Now it's time to go. Let's pop our kiddos in the strollers and go look around outdoors and see what we have to talk about.